Hello and welcome to another episode of Disasters History. This week we're going to cover a disaster of a new kind. This week we're going to talk about the Moorgate Tube disaster. If you haven't gathered from that name, this is about a subway disaster, specifically in the London Underground. There have been a lot of disasters in the time of the London Underground, but this one is probably the strangest and really the only one that doesn't have a good explanation. But we will get there. The London Underground originally started as the world's first underground passenger railway. On January 10, 1863, the Metropolitan Railway opened the first underground railroad between what was then called Bishop's Road and Farringdon Street in northwest London, serving 6 stations at the time. These tunnels were built rather roughly. They followed existing thoroughfares and were essentially long trenches that had rail laid down in them, then the tops were covered up by dirt. They were not deep, which was by design, because these lines would need a lot of ventilation, otherwise you end up with a ton of smoke and steam in the tunnel, which would lead to a massive disaster in and of itself, if not dealt with. This is how much of the first tubes of the London Underground, still not called that yet, were made. Up until about December of 1890. This is when the first electric railway deep underground was open. Because it was electric, this meant there didn't need to be as many ventilation areas because smoke and steam weren't being created and wouldn't cause disasters of suffocation for those aboard the trains. This meant trains could go deep underground. Tunnels could be built over the top of each other. The expansion of the London Underground, still not called this, would be only hampered by money and strength of the tunnels. The first time the system would be called the London Underground would be in 1908. This is also when the world-famous logo became first seen, the red circle with the blue bar with Underground written on it. In 1938, the Underground had their first disaster on record. Technically, it was disasters. Both were just a few months apart. Both involved trains colliding with each other because of signal failures. The first injured 12 people, the second killed 6 people. Both were near the Charing Cross station, but on separate lines. When World War II arrived and the London Blitz began, the stations for the London Underground were used as bomb shelters. Most of them pretty successfully, but there were several major incidents. After the Blitz started in September, the authorities in London were less than pleased with those in the area using the tube stations as bomb shelters. They were frequently full of people by 9 p.m. who had brought all sorts of bedding to sleep there overnight as German bombs were dropped all around the city. Several different times throughout the entirety of World War II, even past the Blitz, bombs found their way into areas and killed a large number of civilians sheltering inside. The biggest disaster was in March of 1943. On that evening, Londoners were expecting retaliatory bombing from the Luftwaffe after the RAF had heavily bombed Berlin 2 days prior. The air raid sirens sounded, and individuals began moving into the staircase for what would become the Bethnal Green station. As everyone filed into the tunnel, a new air defense missile battery fired off, which may have startled those on the stairs because they weren't expecting it. A woman and her child tripped at the base of the stairs and caused many others to fall over. This created a block at the bottom of the stairs and a subsequent crush in the stairway. In total, 173 individuals suffocated and died in the crush in the stairs, causing it to be the deadliest disaster in London Underground history. Overall, the London Underground was one of the safest forms of transportation in the entirety of England. Only 24 people had died in actual incidents in the Underground that weren't related to German bombs. After the war, the Underground continued to flourish and grow. They electrified multiple sections. A new line was added that, for the first time, didn't follow the streets above. All throughout this time, control over the Underground changed hands several times to various boards and councils. By 1970, responsibility for the Underground fell to the Greater London Council. Now, the train involved in this particular incident was 1938 tube stock. The train literally looks like a tube. It's rounded at the top so it fits in the rounded portion of the tunnel, with a few inches of clearance on each side. It literally looks like a tube. It's rounded and it goes right in, and there's 3, 4, 5 inches of clearance on each side. It consisted of 6 train cars in total, a driving motor car, a trailer car, a driving motor car, a driving motor car, a trailer car, and a driving motor car in that order. The driving motor cars had motors to make the train go, obviously. They also contained 42 seats. The trailer cars contained 40 seats for a total of 240 seats available plus standing room in the train. Now, part of the reason the Underground was so safe for so many commuters was because of a rigorous inspection discipline that had been enacted to ensure everything was safe. And this line was no different. Every night, the dead man handle is inspected to make sure it is in working order. The dead man handle is basically, you have to hold it to make the train go. If you let go of it, the train stops. That way, if a engineer has a medical emergency or something of that nature, lets go of it, the train stops and it doesn't continue to go. Every 7 days, there is a full test of the brake equipment, and the brake blocks that are worn are replaced as necessary. This was last performed on this train on the night of February 27th into the 28th, 1975. Every 6 weeks, a full shop inspection was performed. This inspection consisted of literally every piece of equipment on the train being inspected, and anything that needed to be replaced was. This was last done on this particular train on January 17th, 1975. And then once per year, the entire train body is lifted off the bogies, those are the wheel parts, and the wheels are changed. This was last done in May of 1969 for this train. This particular stretch of tube that we're going to be talking about was known as the Northern City Line. It stretched 2.6 miles in length from Drayton Park to Moorgate Station. For those curious where that is in London, Moorgate Station is a few miles northeast of the St. Paul's Cathedral, which we talked about way back in the Great Fire of London episodes. Basically northern-ish London. This stretch consisted of 5 stops in that 2.6 miles. So that brings us to February 28th, 1975. It was a Friday morning as any other. Leslie Newson woke up at around 4 a.m. to begin his day. He packed his lunch and tea, as well as his flashlight, and the driver instruction books he put in plastic to protect them he carried with him to work every day. He kissed his wife on the forehead as she slept, then headed out for the day. He arrived at work and poured himself a cup of tea with another fellow driver, remarking to save him some milk because he would need some later. He then went to his train and set off on the first run of the day from Drayton Park at 6:40 a.m. The first run of the day was slightly different. You see, the guard that was supposed to be on duty, Robert Harris, was late. So instead of assuming his driving position at the south end of the train, the guard/motorman who was on duty the previous shift, Brendan Rosario, suggested Newson go to the north end and act as guard while he drove them to the other station on the first run of the shift. That way, when they got there, Newson would be in position to drive back. Newson agreed, and the two tested the brake system as they did every shift to ensure everything was working properly. Everything checked out, and off they went. They reached the Moorgate station at 6:53 a.m. and picked up Harris. Then they returned to Drayton Park, then back to Moorgate. On this trip back to Moorgate, as passengers were loading onto the train, both Newson and Harris walked into the signal box, basically the place that controls all the signals to tell the train which track to be on, when to go, when to stop, all of that stuff, where one of their coworkers was making tea. They all poured themselves a cup, and Harris tells them he's going camping over the weekend. Newson replies, quote, "I camped enough at Dunkirk, I would rather have a hotel," end quote. And after that, they headed back to the train, tea in hand. Back aboard the train, they went back to Drayton Park, then back to Moorgate, then back to Drayton Park, then back to Moorgate, and then back to Drayton Park again. After this stop at Drayton Park, a young woman got on and shoved herself as far towards the front of the train as she could get. She was desperate to get to the Moorgate station and off as fast as possible because it was a big day for her. Today, 19-year-old Margaret Lyles was going to be sworn in as a policewoman. Sitting near her was another young man, 27-year-old Jeff Benton. He was on his way to work at the London Stock Exchange that morning. At about 7:45 a.m. that morning, a local London cab driver decided to take a fare that would make him late to give his dad a ride into London for work as he normally did. This meant 59-year-old Thomas Thrower would have to take the tube into the city. At the old street stop, one of the 4 along the route from Drayton Park to Moorgate, a young woman named Marion King gets on board on the first carriage. She grabs a hanging strap and begins to read from the novel in her hand. Meanwhile, many individuals are waiting on Platform 9 at Moorgate to get on for their morning commutes. It's Friday morning, so there are a lot of commuters going up and down this particular track. Anthony and his wife Caroline are waiting patiently for their turn. Now, the thing you have to understand here is the layout of the Moorgate station. Platform 9 was on the south side of the tunnel, coming from the Drayton Park direction. The tracks were on the north side and then had a crossover junction that brought the train into Platform 9. Past Platform 9 was an overrun tunnel that was 67 feet long. At the end of the tracks was a blinking red light to warn drivers where to stop. After that was a sand drag piled 2 feet high that was 36 feet long, with 19 of that outside the overrun tunnel and 17 of that inside the overrun tunnel. After the sand drag was a buffer stop, which is a steel device designed to prevent a train from going past the end of the line. And then past that was a solid wall, the end of the line, period. At 8:39 a.m., 1 minute behind schedule, Train 272, which was the train piloted by Leslie Newson, left Drayton Park headed back towards Moorgate. They made each stop as normal. First Highbury and Islington, then Essex Road, then Old Street. Nothing unusual was happening. The speed limit in the tunnel was 40 miles per hour. They weren't doing any faster than that. They would slow down as normal to go into the stations and then stop, pick up passengers, let them off, and then continue on to the next station. The stretch from the Old Street station to Moorgate is where things began to change. At some point between the Old Street station and Moorgate, Harris got bored and left the panel at the very rear of the train to wander around the carriage to see if anyone had left a newspaper he could read. Not a very good thing to do as a guard. Finding none, he decided to stand and read advertisements noticeably far away from where he was supposed to be, right next to the emergency brake. Now, normally, the driver begins to let off the accelerator right before they hit the crossover switch in order to start decelerating before putting on the brakes to slow down to the 15 mile per hour speed limit inside the actual station itself. Many of those aboard the train knew this was the normal procedure, and some began to look around confused as to why they still seemed to be going so fast after they heard the noise of crossing over the crossover switch. In fact, it seemed like the train was picking up speed after going over the crossover switch. On Platform 9, Anthony and Caroline realized something was wrong. They've ridden this train before and know the lights of the train are approaching fast. Way, way, way too fast. The train burst out of the tunnel at least 40 miles per hour. They could see Leslie Newson sitting at the controls, upright, hat on his head, staring straight ahead, unmoving. Completely rigid, absolutely no reaction from him whatsoever. In the front carriage, Robert Lindsay knew everything was wrong. He'd ridden this track many times and knew by now that they should be slowing down, but they're not. He looked for an emergency brake around the cabin that he was in, but couldn't find one, so he just closed his eyes. Javier Gonzalez was also in the first carriage. He was 21 at the time, on his way to class. He looked across the aisle at the woman sitting across from him, who had a blank expression on her face. Then a loud bang, darkness, and silence. The train never slows down before plowing through the red blinking light at the end of the platform. It hits the sand drag and careens right through it. It hits the hydraulic buffer stop, which forces the front of the train upward, but forward momentum plows the train into the upper back corner of the concrete wall beyond it. The front of the first carriage shoved into the wall. The momentum of the second carriage shoved the second carriage up under the back portion of the first carriage, smashing it into a V shape. The 52-foot-long first carriage is smashed into an area of 20 feet. The first 15 seats of the first carriage were smashed into a length of about 3 feet. The wheels of the rear of the first carriage shear off the top of the front of the second carriage, killing some passengers in the second carriage instantly. The front of the third carriage is slammed into the rear of the second carriage, collapsing it. It was a loud bang, then silence for a moment, and then the screams began. The inside of the first carriage was an indescribable horror. First, it was completely dark in this tunnel. No lights whatsoever. Second, the sand trap that they had plowed through had been there for years and was full of not just sand, but dark black dust that was now everywhere inside the first carriage, the second carriage, the third carriage, and now all over Moorgate Station. And third, everyone was now stuck. There was no escaping. They would have to wait. If they were conscious, most of them were not. The man who had made tea early that morning with Leslie Newson, Walter Wade, was the first to call for help. He reached for the telephone on the wall and called London Transport Headquarters Control. Up on the surface, local police officer Graham Bridger was sitting on his motorcycle 2 hours into his shift for the day. He was watching the crowd stream out of Moorgate Station. One man walked directly up to him and said, "There's been a crash down there below." Then he walked off, which is arguably the understatement of the century. Bridger walked into the station and down 2 flights of stairs onto the concourse. There, he saw a number of people coming up the escalator, which for rush hour on a Friday isn't really unusual. What shocked him was all of their faces were stained black with white circles around the eyes, and they all looked dazed, absolutely confused, having no idea what was going on. So he ran down the escalator and found a large group of people looking fully dazed with a dark, dusty cloud hanging everywhere. He found one of the railway workers and asked him what happened. The railway worker pointed at the tunnel and said the tunnel had 3 carriages in it, which, doing quick mental math, Bridger realized shouldn't be possible. This was bad. He sprinted back up to his motorcycle and called Central Control to initiate major accident procedure. The fire department was also called. They had a hard time finding the actual crash, though. One station officer, Chris Wood, stopped to ask a ticket inspector where the crash was, and he replied, "Don't know, chum. Haven't heard of any train crash." Eventually, he made it to the far side of the concourse and saw the blackened faces coming up the escalator. Realized that's probably where the crash is. As he ran down the escalator, the black dust hit him full on in the face. It smelled of hot metal and dust. And at this point, it was oddly quiet, which was weird for a supposed major crash. At the base of the escalator, he saw 3 carriages sitting on the track normally, with one sticking out of the tunnel at a kind of weird angle. But it more or less looked normal. Like, it wasn't unusual. The 3 were sitting on the track. It kind of looked like maybe they'd gotten stuck on the sand a bit in the tunnel. Other than that, not that bad. The briefest thought of, "Oh, this may not be that bad," entered his mind before the reality hit him in the face. He'd ridden this train at this time before. They never only run 4 carriages. Ever. Where were the other 2? There's no way 2.5 carriages were jammed into that short overrun tunnel. He walked over to the start of the tunnel and peered down it. Completely pitch black. Could not see a thing. So, he pulled out his flashlight. He flicked it on and aimed it down the tunnel. What he saw shocked him to his core. Twisted, smashed, crushed metal. And mixed among all of it, bodies. Wood checked with the rail workers to make sure the power for the conductor rails was off, then hopped down to move towards the wreckage. As soon as his flashlight made it over them, that's when it began. What had once been an eerily silent area became filled with the sounds of people moaning, screaming, crying for help, any and all sounds. They needed medical help, and fast. The first medical team to arrive was an odd one. It wasn't an emergency medical team. It was actually the medical team that was located in the British Petroleum headquarters. That's right, BP makes an appearance here, for good this time instead of being the subject of an entire episode, because the British Petroleum headquarters was located literally right next door to the station. 2 doctors and 2 nurses answered the call and immediately headed to the crash location with all the medical supplies that they could carry. Once they got on scene, they realized they didn't have nearly enough. Dr. Donald Dean, the head of the team, realized that there was a pharmacy nearby that supplied all the medicine for his team normally. He could go there and try and get as much medicine as he could carry. So he sprinted up to the surface in the store called Boots and headed to the pharmacist. He was a little nervous that the pharmacist wasn't going to recognize him because his entire face was covered with the same black dust that was hanging in the hair. Luckily, she recognized him and he quickly explained what was happening, and the pharmacist cleared their entire stock of morphine and pethidine, both pain-killing drugs. They then ran back down and began administering to people who were trapped in the carriages. The initial rescue in the third carriage was easy. Most of them were walking wounded, so once they pried open the doors, they could easily get everyone out. This was at 9 a.m. It had only been 14 minutes since the crash. It was around this time Marion King became conscious for the first time. Her brain immediately tells her she's still asleep in bed and is going to be late for work. Then the memories of the crash come flooding back. She quickly then falls back into unconsciousness. The cab driver's father, who took the tube, Thomas Thrower, died almost instantly. Robert Lindsay, who had closed his eyes because he knew the crash was coming, managed to survive and escape the disaster. The second carriage was similar to the third carriage, although the front portion of the second carriage was nearly as bad as the first carriage. The first carriage was an absolute nightmare. Like I said before, it was crushed into a V shape. The back end was shoved up on top of the second carriage. The front end was smashed up into the concrete wall and ceiling in the corner. Once they finally climbed into the first carriage, by literally boosting a firefighter into the air, the true extent of the horror was revealed. There were bodies everywhere, some alive, some dead, all tangled together among the torn and twisted metal. In the back half, a couple were still sitting in their chairs holding hands, only trapped by some small metal. They were easily freed. But once they were out, the firefighter in the carriage could really see what was happening. Down at the V where the carriage had been collapsed was a row of people. The problem was, he could only see their heads. Just a row of human heads. He could not tell if they were attached to bodies or not, or if they were alive or dead. It's an image I don't think I would wish on anyone. But firefighters have a job to do, and so they got to work freeing anyone and everyone they could find. Doctors were lifted in to administer pain medication to those who simply weren't going to make it out. And this whole time, the temperature down in this tunnel is rising. You see, ventilation was designed to be provided by the trains creating piston-type air movement moving through the rounded tunnels. There's not as much clearage around the tunnels, so as the trains move through, it pushes air in front of them, which creates the essentially ventilation provided to provide new oxygen to different parts of the tunnels, if that makes sense. Now, there are normally other trains that run in this section during the day, but obviously they could not continue trains running, so there was no ventilation whatsoever for this tunnel. Temperatures very quickly swelled to nearly 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 degrees Celsius for those not in the US. And oxygen levels inside would drop quickly because no fresh oxygen is being brought in. At one point, medical supplies were running low again, and a doctor was sent to the surface to collect more. There, he was set upon by reporters asking what it was like down there. He replied, quote, "I will tell you, if there is a hell, I have just seen it," end quote. In addition to all of these struggles, the heat, the cramped quarters, the sand and dust in the air, the low oxygen, the sheer confusion of trying to figure out who was alive and who was dead and whose body belonged to who, firefighters could not use heavy cutting equipment. The risk of a fire starting and injury to those trapped was too great. At one point, they cut a hole in the top of the second carriage to help free people that were stuck in the front of it, and it nearly cut into the head of a guy that was trapped there and yelled, "Hey, that's my head, bloke." So they realized that they had to be incredibly careful as to how they were cutting things. So they had to do much of the cutting with hacksaws by hand, which is a grueling task in the best scenarios. And on top of all that, their radios didn't work underground, so they had to manually send runners up and down the multiple staircases that went 70 feet to the surface to ask for supplies, which led to miscommunication similar to what happened during the Grenfell Tower fire, where they would ask for something and it would reach the surface as something else, like the world's most horrifying game of telephone. There's one story that has been repeated that basically they were asking for a particular type of medicine, and when it reached the surface, it came across as a doctor was asking for an empty box and not the medicine that they were actually asking for. So they brought him down an empty box, and that probably upset him greatly. By 10 a.m., a medical team from London Hospital arrived at the scene. They set up a mini operating theater on platform 11. There, they provided more extensive medical treatment to stabilize people before carrying them to the surface. They would also triage patients there by drawing X's on their foreheads. 1 X meant minor injuries, 2 X's meant serious but could be delayed in treatment, 3 X's meant serious injuries needing immediate attention. This mini hospital saw every single casualty pulled out after they set up, even the ones who had already died. Resuscitation was tried on every single person until it was certain that they could not be saved. By 10:20 a.m. or so, Marion King finally regains consciousness again. She's trapped in the first carriage and realizes a firefighter is talking to her. He asks her if she likes dancing. She replies she does. He says back to her, "Well, when you get out of here, I'll take you dancing." Many conversations like this were happening throughout the carriages as firefighters worked to free those trapped and to keep them talking, alert, and their spirits up. Eventually, firefighters pull Marion to safety. You see, what you have to understand about this particular disaster is this is not a quick thing. They have to cut through all of this metal, make sure that they are cutting the right place of the metal so that they're not causing damage to anyone else that is trapped. So you don't want to cut through a specific piece of metal that will then drop more metal onto someone else, causing them further injuries. So it's like a giant game of pickup sticks, except it's smashed into a tunnel in the complete darkness and 120-degree temperature. And if you screw it up, you could potentially maim or kill someone. And that's awful. It's awful. Everything about this was terrible. And at one point, it was so dark and hot that firefighters could only work for 20 minutes at a time before they needed to take a break outside so that they could get oxygen back so that they could go back in to continue working. Now, firefighters see some awful things, and this is an awful situation, and they have some weird coping mechanisms to deal with those things. One of the things that they did on scene was give nicknames to individuals who had clearly died. So, obviously, they're not working to rescue people who are clearly dead. They can't save them. They're going to work on the people who are clearly alive first. So, in order to pass the time, they would talk to the dead people. They would give them nicknames. One of those was a man in a suit still sitting in his seat. They nicknamed him the City Gent. As they would go in and out of the carriage and carry people out, they would make jokes. They would talk to him, the whole 9 yards. Essentially a way to keep their spirits up in what is an absolutely terrifying and atrocious situation. By noon, firefighters had only 5 individuals alive still in the carriages left to be extracted. By 3:15 p.m., only 2 were left. Now imagine that. This disaster happened at 8:46 a.m. You have been trapped in this carriage among a bunch of dead people, listening to every other person that is alive get rescued from this train. It has been 6.5 hours. It is 120 degrees. You are surrounded by twisted metal. You cannot move. You can barely breathe. You probably have multiple injuries. You probably have multiple crush injuries. And you have to sit there and listen to firefighters save everyone else, working their best to get to you. And it's still 6.5 hours of 120-degree heat. Those 2 individuals were left: Margaret Lyles, the 19-year-old soon-to-be police constable, and 27-year-old Jeff Benton. They were in an unfortunate position. When the crash occurred, they had ended up pinned down next to each other. The problem was, every time Margaret attempted to move, it caused Jeff immense pain. She also could not feel her left foot at all. So, for 6.5 hours, every time Margaret moved even slightly, she caused Jeff to scream out in pain, which obviously she doesn't want to do, so she has to keep completely still for as long as possible to not cause him pain. That is a nightmare. That is one of the worst situations I think I've ever heard of someone being in in an episode we've done so far. People have been in some terrible situations. This is arguably one of the worst, because not only is she trapped, and if she moves, she causes someone else immense pain and could potentially lead to their death. She also is surrounded by dead bodies, and those dead bodies have been smashed. So it's likely that there is blood, other people's blood, all over her. She can hear groans and screams. She can hear the groaning of the metal all around her as it shifts as the firefighters attempt to reach her to rescue her, because this is not a stable situation. So, like, as they move through the carriages, it's going to cause things to shift and move and all of that. So she doesn't know that if a firefighter gets close to her, if that will cause her pain, if that will cause Jeff pain, if that will make it worse for the two of them. This is I don't even know how to describe it. It feels incredibly claustrophobic because it's completely dark. You can see the occasional flashlight. You can feel the dust entering your lungs. You can't cough, because if you cough, you cause Jeff pain. You can't move, because if you move, you cause Jeff pain. You can't move yourself because you're afraid that if you move too much, it will cause yourself more pain and him more pain and kill you or kill him. You don't know if anyone around you is still alive and just unconscious, so you don't want to move too much. It's just an all-around terrible, terrible situation. Essentially, at this point, firefighters were trying to make sure Margaret was as comfortable as possible as they worked out a way to get her and Jeff out. They asked Margaret if she wanted another policewoman constable to come give her company, and she replied, "I'd sooner have one of the lads." For the next 5 hours, firefighters would try every possible way they could think of to get Margaret and Jeff out. But they realized at about 8 p.m. there was only one way it was going to be successful. They would have to amputate Margaret's left foot. Firefighters would hold up flashlights so doctors can see what they were doing. Margaret at one point asked who was going to carry her out, and the firefighters told her they were fighting for the right to carry her out. Doctors came in, put her to sleep, and then amputated her foot. Because of the way Jeff was trapped, he had to watch the entire amputation. Once her foot was amputated, they pulled both Margaret and Jeff out. Margaret would go on to serve as a police constable for 1 year before retiring. Sadly, Jeff died of his crush injuries a few months after the disaster. They were finally pulled out at 10 p.m. They spent essentially 14 hours inside this train in 120-degree heat, listening to everyone else be rescued before them. As soon as they are pulled out and away, rescue workers call for silence. All work stops. No one moves. No one speaks. Barely anyone breathes. They're all straining to hear if anyone is still alive in the carriages. The only sound they hear is the sound of creaking metal from the slowly shifting, crushed train. Everyone left inside is dead. At 2 a.m., firefighters are finally able to successfully remove the man they refer to as the City Gent. His name was Bernard Marks. In total, 43 individuals died due to the disaster. 74 individuals were injured and taken to local hospitals. It would take workers 4 full days to cut away enough of the carriages to reach the body of Leslie Newson at his position in the driver's seat. The cab that had once had a depth of 3 feet was crushed to a measly 10 inches. Inside the cab, workers made a shocking discovery that made the mystery of this crash even more mysterious. You see, in order to keep the train running at speed, the driver would have to keep their hand on what is known as a dead man switch, which we talked about earlier. It's there to make the train go. If you let go of it, the train stops. It's to prevent disasters like this from happening. So if there's a medical emergency or something like that, the conductor or the engineer lets go of the dead man switch, the train stops. They don't have a disaster like this. The position that Newson's body was found in, however, indicated he had likely held the dead man switch all the way to the point of impact. His left hand was near the brake handle and his right hand was near the main controller. They had also determined that his hand had remained on the dead switch all the way up until the collision with the wall because of x-rays taken and showing how his hand had broken in the disaster. There was no indication that he had put his hands up to brace for impact or moved in any capacity before the collision. You would think that if you were headed towards what you know is a solid wall, you would at least put your hands up like this in an attempt, like up in front of your face, in an attempt to, shield yourself from what is coming. Even if you were suicidal, you would think shock, just from shock. But that's not what happened. He stayed exactly where he was, as if he was intentionally driving it to continue on the way as if there was more track in front of him. An autopsy performed on Leslie Newson's body showed no signs of any medical emergency. A toxicology report indicated that he had a very small amount of alcohol in his bloodstream, but that was consistent with the production of alcohol in the bloodstream after death and having sat in the heat for 4 days. In addition, everyone who spoke to him that morning had no indication he'd been drinking at all. Suicide has also been ruled out. He had money in his pocket to buy a car for his daughter after work and had spoken warmly to everyone that morning, talking about what he was going to do later that day. He'd also driven the same route multiple times that morning already, in which he could have committed suicide without harming so many others. Now, there have been several reports that Leslie Newson overran several stations before, and it may have indicated that he was attempting to gauge just how much speed he would need to actually commit suicide by train. However, his wife, his daughter, his coworkers, everyone that knew him indicated that he very much liked his job. He was a very happy man. There were no indications that he would commit suicide. There's absolutely no evidence of any reason that this man drove this train at full speed into a solid concrete wall. There's been temporary amnesia explanation given. There's been several explanations given, a temporary stroke that doesn't show up on the autopsy afterwards. There have been several reasons given, but none of them make sense, because in addition to evaluating Leslie Newson, they also evaluated all parts of the train. Everything worked properly. Nothing was out of working order, including the brakes. And back on the stop just before the Moorgate station, Leslie Newson had tested the brakes to make sure that they were working before continuing on to the Moorgate station before crashing into the wall. There is literally zero explanation as to why this particular disaster happened. It seems like the most likely scenarios are either suicide, which we don't really have good evidence for at all, or there was some kind of medical emergency that he had that froze him in place, that did not remove his hand from the dead man switch, did not cause him to collapse, essentially just stayed there. It's very weird. And most of the things that would kill him instantly, that would leave him at sitting straight up, likely would have showed up on an autopsy or a medical examination of some sort afterwards. And there was absolutely nothing. Essentially, whatever happened with this train, whether it was suicide, some sort of medical emergency, lay with Leslie Newson. He is the only one that knew what was happening in this train. And unfortunately, we will never know what exactly happened here. It is one of the strangest disasters in history, one of the most unexplained disasters in history for a transportation system that is so safe, that very rarely has disasters. And when those disasters occur, they're relatively small in nature. To have something like this happens is completely out of the blue. Nothing like this has happened since. So whatever occurred here, the knowledge of it died with Leslie Newson smashed into that 10 inches of cab in the front of that 1938 rolling stock. And with that, we've reached the end of this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, you can follow me on all social medias. It's Disastrous History on basically all of them. I appreciate you all for listening and enjoying this podcast. It is me and my wife doing all of it. So the fact that you guys are still here almost 5 and some change years later is really, really cool. So I appreciate you all so much. Thank you. As always, stay safe and remember to check your smoke detector batteries.